As you see, the scripture this morning comes from 3 different places in the 7th chapter of Mark. One is verses 1 through 8, then it goes to 14 and 15 and ends up with 21 and 23. I'm saying this in case you would like to use your pew Bibles to follow along with the reading. I'm not going to stop and say, now this is 13 and 14, because the thought is continuous. So, okay. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands. That is, they didn't wash first. Now, the Pharisees and all the Jews, do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And they don't eat anything from the market until they wash it first. And there are also many other traditions they observe, the washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not live according to the traditions of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? And Jesus said to them, Isaiah was prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it's written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold the human tradition. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing but by going in, unless it's poison, of course, can defile. But it's the things that come out are what defile. It is what comes, and he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is written from the human, what comes from within the human heart. And from the human heart, evil intentions can flow. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things, they come from within, and they defile a person. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks. Thank you.
So every church has her stories, don't they? Her history, her traditions. Ours certainly has enough stories and tradition, and they're good. They all matter. They're important to making us who we are. So I was thinking about stories of churches, and when I was getting ready to preach this sermon, I was reminded of a church that I heard about several years ago. And I wanted to spend a lot of this sermon telling you her story. During the late 70s and 80s and into the 90s at this church, every Sunday, unless it was being used for something else, a group of men met in the kitchen of the church. They met on Sunday morning before worship, and they just hung out there. They didn't use a Sunday school book, even though it was the Sunday school hour. They didn't take any kind of attendance. They didn't collect an offering. It seemed that they just taught. They just talked and they laughed and they listened and they pondered the world. They talked about sports and politics and all the did you hear abouts from the week before. And they drank coffee and they ate donuts, sometimes cinnamon buns and sometimes those bear claws things. They really liked those. And they smoked cigarettes there. They'd wash out the ashtrays when they got through every Sunday morning and then put them back up under the sink where they belonged, but you still knew. Now, when the kitchen was in use, they would meet outside. If it was raining, they'd get up under the portico so they wouldn't get wet. These guys usually wore flannel shirts in the wintertime. They wore overalls or they wore shorts in the summer. They were not overly fashion conscious, that's for sure. Let's just put it like that. And the wives of those who were married, they had given up long, long ago on trying to get them to wear those tattered old T-shirts that, after you wash them and wash them and wash them, and they get so big, and that's when they really, really get comfortable. They were just guys. They were just hanging out. Now, at some point in the life of this church, um, the cabinet sent them a young female pastor. Now, she was the first female that had ever come to this church. This was back, probably in the 90s, maybe late 80s, and there weren't that many of us then. But she was sent to this church, and there were never any questions. The church welcomed her and loved her and received her from the very first day because she was their pastor. That's what they understood, and they were going to help her as much as they could, and all they wanted for her was what was good. But as I say, she was young, and with youth, if we can remember back, a lot of us, with youth comes a shortness of experience. It's not our fault when we're young, but there is a shortness of experience. With youth come lessons of life that have not yet been learned. As a matter of fact, in her inexperience, this young woman fell victim to her youth, and she did some pretty unfortunate things. But it was her first church, and she was newly out of seminary. She was well on her way to ordination, and she wanted to be perfect. We can understand that. She did. She wanted to do everything just right. So she began to think about the church during the week. And every time she started thinking about the church, the first on the list was always these men in the kitchen of her church on Sunday morning. And it just didn't sit right with her, you know? And she got to the point where she was thinking, well, what gives them the right to ignore the traditional Sunday school that we've created within our church and just to hang out wherever they want? And what do they talk about in there anyway? She wondered. Now, she didn't feel comfortable inviting herself in and going and sitting with them. To be truthful, she didn't know what she would say. And they were a little rough looking, you know? In her youth, she had been taught to be cautious about men who looked like this. But she sure did sit in her office and think about them a lot and fret over them a lot. And she thought to herself, they should be in Sunday school, taking roll and using United Methodist curriculum. Why aren't they there? They should wear clothes that are more respectful to Sunday morning worship. And goodness gracious, smoking in the church building? That couldn't be right. That could not be right. But nobody seemed to care. And the more she thought about it, the more she thought, okay, this is just going to be up to me. She thought that she heard God telling her to fix this. She heard God telling her to get these men back on track, to get them in the place where they were supposed to be, to get them to show some respect. And if they couldn't do that, well, then maybe it was just time for them to move on to another church. I mean, she did have the discipline of the United Methodist Church. The discipline is our rule book that tells us how we are supposed to do things. And if you look at it, it says that one of the responsibilities of an elder or a pastor in the church is to order the life of the church. Now, I think basically what that means is we're supposed to make sure that our worship covers all the seasons of the Christian year, like, Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter and Pentecost, and we're to make sure that the church learns as much about God as they can through worship. But in her eyes, just then, she was looking at the word order in just a little different way, and that church needed some order. And she thought God must have sent her there to do that very thing. So she began her plan. She went to Home Depot or Staples somewhere, I'm not sure where, and she bought 10 bright orange signs that said no smoking. She used her own money to buy it. And one Saturday morning, when nobody was there, she hung all those signs up all around the fellowship hall, all in the kitchen and all in the bathrooms. And right under each one of those signs, she put another little sign, and it said, "Everyone must be in a Sunday school class at 9:45 sharp." And she thought, that's going to solve the problem. That's it. I have ordered the life of my church. And she talked about it in the announcement. She put the announcements in the bulletin. She put in on her email that she sent out each week, like I do, the Sundays coming. She put, "This church is a smoke-free building." Anywhere she could put it, she put it. She hinted about it in her welcome. She prayed about it in her prayer. But it was when she preached a sermon on how to behave at church that the members knew that they needed to do something and to do it pretty quickly. So they elected a lovely older woman from the congregation to have a talk with their new pastor. The woman had been a member there for over 50 years, and she loved her church, and the church loved her because she was wise and she was kind and she was funny and caring and trusted. So on Monday morning, she called her new young preacher and asked if she could come see her. And as she settled in across from her new friend, here is what she said. She said, "I am so glad you are here." She said, "I've been praying for a female pastor for our church for a long time, and God has sent you, and I know that you are going to bring us so much joy." But then she went on to say, "Even though you don't know it, already you're making a serious mistake. And I need to tell you about it. Because if you continue with your plan to encourage the demise of our guys in the kitchen on Sunday morning, you will never be an effective leader in this church." She said, "You'll never have the respect of the congregation. You'll never have the support of the congregation. In short, it is not going to turn out well." And she went on to say, "I know what you're thinking. Everything has to be organized and tidy, and everyone has to follow the rules. I was a school teacher. I understand that. I really, really do." She said, "But we discovered a long time ago that Jesus was not very good at following rules. And maybe we should not be either. He didn't tell us to stay safe. He didn't tell us to strive for organization and status quo, to put everybody in their little cubicle and make them stay there. He told us to hunt for holy mischief. That's what this group of men has been teaching this church." She said, "A few years ago, our church was in bad shape. We were worried. It was just like many others. It was struggling. It was really, really struggling. It seemed like nothing was happening." She said, we were trying our best. We were trying to do all the right things, the things that we had always done. But it all just seemed empty somehow. It all just seemed like we were going through the motions. There were no new members, there were no new ministries. The world was going on all around us, but we were caught up here inside the walls. And we were worshiping a God who looked just like us and a God who said only the things that we wanted to hear. But these men, she said, one day, about 8 years ago, God got a hold of them. She said, I know that doesn't sound very theological, but it's the only thing we can come up with. God got a hold of them and they challenged us. They became our leaders. They dared us to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And we aren't there yet, but we're trying. We're moving in the right direction. Now, she said, I know you hadn't gotten to know them. I know you hadn't gone in there. You were a little intimidated by them. She said, but here's who these men are, because I want you to know, here's what they do. They are the ones who get up before dawn when they are needed and represent our church in disaster relief work all over the state, all over the country sometimes. They go and they give up their time, they give up their passion, they are there if there's a flood, if there's a storm, if there's a fire. They're offering their hands, they're offering their time. And she said they're the ones who organize mission trips for us, not only to other parts of the world, but just here in the community, because they're the ones who are out and seeing what's going on. And they challenge us and encourage us to get out and meet people and share Christ with them. They're the ones who gather every Tuesday without fail at 5 o'clock in the morning with a group of about 50 men in the community from all different denominations for a time of Bible study and prayer. They're the ones who are always available to our older members if they have car trouble, if they need a yard raked, if they need a board nailed down, if they need some kind of work at their house. They've organized themselves so they are always available to go and help when they can. They are the ones who are Stephen Ministers, which is a wonderful program in the church where lay people, congregational members, will mentor and walk with and support people who are struggling in the congregation. They're the ones who teach in public school, she said, and coach Little League and give hour upon hour to being the hands and feet of Christ. She said 8 years ago, and they're all ages. Some are young and some are older and retired. The age does not matter. She said 8 years ago, they were ready to leave this church. They were ready to give up religion. They got tired of trying to please God by obeying all the rules. But then, like I said, God got a hold of them and they started letting their hearts lead them. And through them, we have seen God work miracle after miracle after miracle around here. And she paused for just a second. And then she said, so that's why you need to go right this minute and take down all those signs you put up without asking anyone. That's why you need to mosey on in the kitchen next Sunday and find out what your strongest and most faithful members are up to. For I can promise you, they are the life of this church. And it won't be until you can walk in their shoes that you can walk in ours. Love that story. In our scripture today, Jesus is up against the same thing. But it's not just a righteous young pastor that he is up against. It's a whole system that he's against, a system of rules and regulations that have come to be seen to the Jews over the last few centuries as their religion. They've gotten it confused. They've gotten trapped in this regulatory, responsible life that leaves them very little time for anything else. And Jesus is having a meal with his disciples. It's really just a normal day. There's not much going on anywhere else. They're just eating. And the Pharisees and scribes who have helped to create these laws and who always follow them and encourage everyone else to do that as well, they came up and they said, um, Jesus, your disciples didn't wash their hands before they ate. Why? Why is that? Hand washing was crucial to the law. It was one of the biggies, one of the things that they had to do. In order to make hands that were unclean clean, there was a ritual that they went through. And they would hold their hands like this, and someone would pour water over them, and they would rub. And then after they had rubbed their hands, the water was unclean still. And so they had to put their hands down like this, and water was poured over and it dripped off until their hands could be considered clean. Rabbis had been put to death for not following that ritual just one time. And there was a story of one rabbi who had been arrested and he was in jail and he was just at the point of death from dehydration, from thirst. And he got access to just a little bit of water that could have saved his life. But you know what he did with it, don't you? He washed his hands instead. Because in his mind, to please God, one had to obey the law, every tiny ritual that had been created over the years. There were thousands of them. There were so many that you didn't have time for anything else. Just think about the story of the Good Samaritan. You remember the priest? The guy was dying on this side of the road, and what did the priest do? He just walked on by. It didn't mean that he was a bad guy. He was just so busy following the rules and the regulations that there was no time to do anything else. That to touch this man would have meant he would have been unclean and would have had to have gone through this whole process of making himself clean again. It was a big deal. I cannot even imagine living. I mean, we talk about just you don't wear white after Labor Day. That's one of our rules and regulations. You know, you don't wear pantyhose with sandals, kind of thing. We have rules and regulations, but they're nothing. They are nothing like the Jewish people had at the time that Jesus lived on this earth. That's what he was up against. He was a Jew, Jesus was, but he was also the Son of God. He was also the Messiah, and the law was not the ministry that God had sent him to carry out. Y'all, I mean, in a nutshell, this is the heart of what God called Jesus to do. This was the heart of what he needed to accomplish. And Jesus pushes the envelope. He goes against the rules. He speaks the holy mischief that God has called him to. And to these scribes and Pharisees that are asking about the hand washing, he says, oh, yeah, I read about y'all in Isaiah. And I'm reading this from the Message. These people make a big show of saying the right thing, but their heart isn't in it. They act like they are worshiping me, but they don't mean it. They just use me as a cover for teaching whatever suits their fancy, ditching God's command of love and taking up the latest fads. Now, this is the kind of thing that got Jesus killed. And then Jesus went on to say another thing. He said, food, by the way, let me just mention this. He said, food is not good and bad. You know, you say that there's some food that's clean, some food that's unclean. You can't eat them. Sometimes you can't eat them off the same plate. You can't prepare them in the same kitchen. All these rules and rituals that regard food. And Jesus says it's not what you put into your body that defiles you. Food can't make you unclean. God's created the human body so it works perfectly. You take in the food, your body gets the nourishment from the food, and then the rest of it goes in the sewer. End of story. It's no big deal. So it's not what goes in your body, it's what comes out of your heart that God is interested in. Now, this right here is where it gets personal for us, right? Because Jesus lists this whole set of unfortunate, evil intentions that can beset us and can pour out of our hearts for the world to see. Linda read them for us. Big old scary words: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, wickedness, avarice, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. These things sound terrible, don't they? And we might think, oh my gosh, it must have really been an evil world way back then. But y'all, here's the truth. They may be big old words, but it's just the same old messed up life that we all know so well. I live in it, you live in it, we all do to some extent or another. We all get caught up in the rat race. We all have to have more and more and more, a bigger house, a bigger truck, more money, spending more time on work and making money than making a difference in the world. Telling little white lies to get ahead, holding on to what we have rather than helping others, having thoughts of unfaithfulness to our spouses, throwing someone else under the bus if it protects us. Probably for most of us, it's just every now and then being a jerk who has to have our own way. Nothing has changed. Nothing. But here's the good news. This table has not changed. Not since Jesus said it for his disciples in the upper room before he went out into the garden and before he was arrested. This table is where we face our sin. This table is where our hearts are heard. It's where we lay bare our hearts. It's where this broken bread reminds us that we are broken and that Jesus, in seeking the holy mischief to which he was called, allowed himself even to be broken for us. You're invited. Every one of you, always. We are all invited. We are invited to this place of assurance. God is with us, always calling, always forgiving, always loving, always growing us up into true righteousness, a righteousness that we cannot find on our own, but that can only be found in Him. Will you come?